Alright, gang. Last video in the Ten Commandments series, and again, I know the board isn't super visible, but hopefully at least by way of gesture back and forth, you'll get the idea of what I'm pointing to. So this is covering the second tablet of the law, the second half, even though it's not an even division, of the Ten Commandments, those which pertain to our relationships with other people. So the first three commandments are about our relationship with God, which we've got to get straight if we want to be able to have right relationship with other people. And again, the church is really insistent that, in principle, this is all knowable by the use of natural reason. But God chose to reveal it to us because most of us don't have the time, energy, inclination, or ability to just kind of think ourselves to the specific maxims of the moral order. So it works like this. The fourth commandment is honor your father and mother. Now, one of the things about the commandments is that they contain much more in them than the few words that make up the sentences themselves would at first seem to indicate. So, the commandment, honor your father and mother, is the first commandment that is offered not with a curse or a caution against it, but a promise. Honor your father and your mother that your days may be long in the land, right? So that if you honor your parents, good things will come of you. Now remember, the commandments are really establishing a law in Israel, and they're going to be a lawed people now, a people under the law, who live in, with, and surrounding the law. And for that reason, the honoring of the parents is really the root of the Jews and later the church's understanding of respect for authority in general. Our parents are the first authority that most of us encounter, and it is only through our parents that we wind up encountering the other authorities that make up our lives together. Offenses against honoring our parents would be things like disobedience, obviously. So to disobey your parents is a direct violation of the fourth commandment. Abandonment, and this works both ways. When children abandon their parents, when a dad just ups and leaves the woman that he got pregnant and their kid, then that's abandonment. But when a child just up and leaves parents whom he knows are ill and are going to need care for, and there's not some sort of compelling reason, then that's abandonment too. So honoring parents winds up working both directions. It establishes relationships between parents and children. Neglect. Obviously, parents neglecting their children is a serious sin, not taking care of their essential needs, food, clothing, medical stuff, right? But likewise, children neglecting their parents. And rebellion. So this, we often think of this in the context of like teenage rebellion of parents, which is kind of like super obedience, but this really reflects more on the relationship that we've got to authorities in general. Our parents are our first experience of authority, but very quickly most of us have an experience of kind of auxiliary authorities that are near to or attached to our parents. Our grandparents being probably the most obvious one, aunts and uncles who are sort of on par or peers with our parents, and so they're kind of surrogate parents when our parents aren't around. I know this happens perhaps less now than it did once upon a time, but neighbors or the parents of other kids our age, right? So when your mom's not there, but your buddy's mom is, she can tell you to knock that stuff off. And this is important because it helps establish patterns of authority and obedience that are going to wind up marking your whole life. God sets our parents over us in authority precisely because it is our parents who've given us life. And it is from our parents that we're apprenticed into society, that we learn the kind of social norms that we need to be able to be productive and healthy members of society. That's why it's at the head of the relationship with other people in the law. The fourth commandment really establishes the order of authority in the home, in the church, and in the world, so that the parents of the household, the parents serving as the head of the household, parallel then what happens as civil authorities function as heads of the state or of the nation, and likewise how church authorities act as parents, fathers of the church. Parallel to the order of authority is what's called the order of charity, and there's a chart that I may draw at some later point for you to see, but think of it in terms of concentric circles. At the very, very center of the circle in the order of charity is God, right? So our first love needs to be God. Our love for God has to be primary before our love for anybody else. In the second circle, I know it's counterintuitive. I know a lot of us, including myself, struggle with this one. But in the second circle is self. We can't love our neighbors as ourselves if we're not very good at loving ourselves. So we have to love ourselves and value our own worth and desire our own salvation if we want to grow in God's love and commands. And so love of self is necessary in order then to reach out to love first of parents. So we love our parents first chronologically because they're the first people that we meet. We also have to be able to love them first before we're able to love even our own children, though we ought to love our children, of course, but we're only able to love our children because of the way that our parents showed us how to love. Now someone might say, very reasonably, I grew up in a really awful home, Father. My parents never showed me any love. I'm very sorry. That's horrible. That shouldn't be the case. And it's precisely because you know that shouldn't be the case that you can tell you're the exception rather than the rule, right? So that even if this wasn't your own personal experience, it is sort of the collective experience of humanity. And so our understanding of parents who both give life and lay down their lives for the sake of those over whom they have care sets out the pattern for all authority. After parents and children, sort of what we would think of as immediate family, come, of course, the rest of the family, extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, friends, neighbors, grandparents, all that sort of thing. Then the next circle would include things like friends, people to whom we're bound by bonds of affection, but not necessarily blood, or by bonds of location, but not necessarily affection. So friends and neighbors, right? So it's the thing where, if a tree falls on somebody's house, clearly the people in the house are those most responsible for getting the tree off. Failing themselves personally being able to do so, their own family could come and help move the tree off. If the family's unable to do so or aren't around or unwilling, right, then you might call a buddy and have your buddy help you get the tree off. If your buddy can't come help you, you might go to a neighbor, especially if you know he's got a winch or something like that. Say, help, I need to get this tree off of my house. But it makes sense for you to go to your neighbor, the guy who lives next door or across the street, in a way that it doesn't make sense to go to some random guy on the other side of town. If the random guy on the other side of town is your cousin, or if the random guy on the other side of town is your friend, then it might make sense. But it doesn't make any sense to just drive from here on the south side to Clive and say, help, got to get a tree off my house. And, of course, you've got a relationship, even to the guy in Clive, that you don't have with a guy in Ethiopia. Why? Well, because you guys live in the same city, or at least around the same city. You certainly live in the same state, in the same country, so you share citizenry. And so it's just trying to articulate why it is we have natural bonds that tie us to the people closest to us rather than those that are furthest away. Though we're bound to live, it's called the order of charity on purpose. You're bound to have love or charity even for the guy in Ethiopia. He's just further down on the list than the kid that lives in your house. The bonds of charity also help to structure authority. So an authority, whether that's an authority in the church, an authority for the state, an authority in the family, an authority in a fraternal organization, anything, they need to perceive of their authority, their obligations over the people that are their subjects, based on the order of charity, which means that the person in leadership needs to be willing to give of themselves for the sake of those over whom they have charge. It's the Lord's admonition to the disciples. The pagans lord it over those over whom they have authority. It shall not be so with you. He who would be greatest among you must make himself the least. And then, likewise, this has implications for the state. So the state has an obligation to protect the family. And the state has the obligation to protect the family precisely because the state derives, it only comes from the fact of families. So families don't exist for the sake of keeping the state going. Individuals don't exist for the sake of being good citizens. Rather, we try and form our children into good citizens in order to help the state run well. But that's because it works for our benefit and not the other way around. When individuals or families or groups simply become instruments of the state, then the state is failing in its most essential duty of care toward its citizenry. That's important because the church is really a communion of domestic churches. We use the phrase domestic church to talk about Christian households, and this is true even in those households where the Christians inside may belong to different ecclesial communities. One's Catholic, one's Protestant, one's Catholic, one's Orthodox. But they're meant to be, really and truly, domestic churches in the sense that the home is to be primarily a place of prayer, and that when we come together, especially for the Holy Eucharist, when we come together as church to pray together in the church building, that we're really a communion of churches, right? So that the parish of Christ the King is really the church of the Keyhoes and the Valdezes and the Burns and the McManuses. And it is certainly true that not all of these domestic churches look the same. So Father Ronaldo and Father George and I constitute a household in a different sort of a way than my mom and my dad and my sister and I were a household growing up. Or than my dad and my sister and my niece are a household now. This isn't some sort of dig at families that aren't neat and tidy. It's simply a recognition of what the ideal is, so that then if things are less than ideal, we know what it is we're trying to supply for. My niece's not having her dad very involved in her life means that my dad and I have to step up in a way that otherwise we wouldn't have to, right? It's that kind of thing. The final thing I want to say about honoring your parents is that this comes up in confessions and spiritual direction a lot, and I think is really worth our reflecting on. Honoring your parents looks very different when you're 5 than when you're 15 than when you're 50. When you're 5, honoring your parents largely means doing what they tell you to do when they tell you to do it. When you're 15, you're beginning to understand that mom and dad don't know everything. Mom and dad might not be right all the time, and there might even be times, hopefully pretty rare, where I have to not do what mom and dad say because it would be a sin or a mistake. When we're 50, honoring our parents may actually mean doing the exact opposite of what they say. Being obedient might mean not doing what they say. Like, Mom, it's not safe for you to stay in the house anymore. Or Mom, it's not safe for you to drive anymore. I have to take the car keys away. You can't take these away. You might have to. And that's not dishonoring your parents. It's actually fulfilling your filial duty, your childly duty, your care for your aging parents when they can no longer take care of themselves. So honoring parents works both directions, both parent to child and child back up to parent as we grow. The 5th commandment, thou shalt not kill, is concerned, of course, primarily with life, but also all those things that are necessary to make up a healthy and fruitful and fulfilled life. So the most obvious offense against the 5th commandment is the sin of murder. And it's no accident that in the scriptures, the first sin we see after the fall isn't sexual, even though people would tell you that we're very obsessed with sex, or that sex is the original sin or the fruit of the original sin. Churches never taught that because it's not true. The first sin we see after the fall is the sin of murder, the story of Cain and Abel. And it's likewise no accident that in the story, the two parties, the murderer and the victim, are brothers. There's an especially intense awfulness about taking life from the one to whom you're most connected. So the church recognizes that murder is always and universally bad, but there are some kinds of murder that strike against us harder than others. Parricide, killing our parents; fratricide, killing our siblings; and especially infanticide, killing our own children. These are especially grave offenses against the moral order because these are precisely the people that we're meant to take most care of. Because of this, the church's stance on abortion is very strong and very insistent. There's something really horrible about mothers permitting a physician to kill their children. Now, this is recognizing that there's hardly a woman left in the country that's not been touched either personally or indirectly through a close friend or family member, and therefore there's no man left in the country who hasn't been touched in a rather immediate way by abortion. And the church's goal here is not just to make people feel sick or dirty or guilty about things that they've done, any more than the church is insisting that lying is wrong, is meant to make all of us feel guilty because we've all lied. It is rather to insist that there are certain things which simply cannot be tolerated in a just society, and that the murder of infants, which was common, of born infants in the Roman Empire, only died because of the rise of Christianity, that the murder of infants in the womb simply cannot be tolerated. The problem with abortion is less about a tension between the rights of the unborn child over and against the rights of the mother, as in establishing the responsibilities over sexual activity. Now, of course, there are situations in which people become pregnant by acts of sex against their will. Pregnancy through rape is horrible, and yes, as a priest, I've had to deal with that more times than I would like to myself. But that doesn't justify the murder of the child. It may justify that mother is not the person best equipped to raise that child. That's a whole different question. It is very, very telling that as societies go, abortion was virtually universally illegal until just 40 or 50 years ago. Now it's been reframed in the language of rights. We'll talk more about rights when we come to the section on Catholic social teaching, but the move here fundamentally is that people have rights, and we don't get to choose which people we afford those rights to. Euthanasia is sort of an offense against life in the other direction. Euthanizing, good dying, right, is what we do to animals when they come near the end of their life, when they stop being useful to us. And so it has been proposed and is happening in places that we euthanize or put to death early the elderly or the sick, those who appear to have little or no use left for society, and especially are perceived as a drain on society because of the resources that it takes to maintain them. And the Church stands strongly against this. Either life is a primary value that deserves respect in the law and protection, or it isn't. And you don't get to choose which people are worth protecting and not. Chesterton has this line where he says, people seldom differ about those things they deem evil, but they differ very much about those things they deem excusable. Virtually every society that's ever lived and existed for any period of time has a prohibition on killing. But similarly, almost every society who has had a prohibition on killing has had some group of people that they thought it was okay to kill, whether that's the unborn, or criminals, or people from the other side of town, or whatever, people we don't like. Euthanasia is a much bigger problem than probably most of us are willing to give it credit for, and is an absolutely integral part of the Church's pro-life stance. We're not simply anti-abortion, we're anti-people dying that don't need to, right? Anti-people dying unnatural deaths. Similarly, suicide, whether individual or assisted by a physician or other medical practitioner, is a grave offense against the Fifth Commandment. God is the Lord of life, and we're not. We don't get to choose when we die, even if it seems life really sucks right now. And while it might be counterintuitive, scandal, that is causing the spiritual death of another, leading another person into sin. So scandal is not the way we typically use it now. It's not, National Enquirer or pearl clutching, oh, what did the celebrity do today? That's not typically what the Church means by scandal. Scandal is what happens when we lead another into sin. Now, that doesn't mean the other person isn't responsible for their own behavior too, but especially when a person in authority leads another person into sin, we have a higher standard that we're set to, and so there's a greater guilt that falls upon the authority who leads someone, especially an impressionable person, into sin. It's the reason the sex abuse scandals, the clerical abuse scandals in the Church, are genuine scandals. First, because the priest led the person that they abused into sin. Not that the abuse was the sin, but lots of the subsequent stuff. And then much more profoundly, because the cover-up led all of us into all kinds of sinful attitudes and behaviors relative to the Church. Each of these is fulfilled. The law is fulfilled in a positive direction the other way. The offense of murder is fulfilled by the administration of the civil order. It's why the high calling to police and the protection of the public good is so important. So we order and organize our civil lives. We protect the lives of the citizenry. The people who put their lives on the line in order to protect us are due a great deal of debt by all of society. And this helps contrast against murder. Abortion. The Church cannot be simply against abortion in law or try and convince people against abortion. In fact, we have to show respect and care for all life, from conception to natural death. And that's not just like words that we use, that's backed up in the way that we run our hospitals, our healthcare facilities, and especially things like crisis pregnancy centers. So one of the things I'm proudest of here at Christ the King is the presence of the Intervisions Health Clinic just around the corner from the parish, and they really do it. You know, people will often lob this slur, you're only pro-life until the baby's born, then nobody cares about you. That may be true of political parties or individual politicians. It ain't true of the Catholic Church. Nobody does more to provide care for women and children than the Catholic Church. So if you've got a problem with it, come see me and I will literally take you to the place where we will take care of the women and the children. But in order for us to maintain this stance, we have to continue this work. Similarly, relative to euthanasia, we have to provide not simply adequate but holistic and positive health care for the aged and the ill. And that's especially true in this time, right? During the coronavirus outbreak. I really think this is a time when we can see that the country might be more pro-life than we were giving it credit for, because we've basically shut down the nation for the sake of the sick and the elderly. That's a sign that we do still really care about life, or at least that those in the medical field who are advising legislators care about life. We got to pay attention to that. Suicide. We have to help provide mental health care services. The National Suicide Hotline is run out of Boys Town, Nebraska, right? Which is, in origin at least, a Catholic institution that's meant to serve underprivileged communities. So you know, we're not simply scolding people to commit suicide or making people feel bad when their loved ones have committed suicide. My best friend from high school committed suicide when we were in college. This is a world I know very well. The way that we combat suicide isn't simply by saying, don't commit suicide. It's by ensuring that appropriate mental health care is made available for everybody. And likewise, we combat the sin of scandal by way of integrity. Personal integrity, institutional integrity, right? We don't lead people into sin. It's important when we recognize our own sin, especially when we hold any kind of public office or position, to be able to acknowledge that sin, so as to not lead other people into scandal. You know, people have higher expectations of their leaders than they do of themselves, but most people don't actually expect their leaders to be perfect, and it can go a long way just to admit when I've made a mistake or when I'm wrong. I try very hard to do that, and I know that many of my brothers do too. So the fifth commandment is about a lot more than just not killing people. The sixth commandment, there's a lot going on here, and both the sixth and the seventh commandment pertain to two topics that are desperately important enough that I'm going to devote two whole other talks to here before Easter. The sixth commandment to Christian sex and sexuality, the seventh commandment to what we call social justice, justice in society and the just distribution of goods and services. And so I'm going to do these rather speedily, simply to point out what they imply without saying so directly, and then what we're really being called to. But the nuts and the bolts of it will really come in the later talks. The sixth commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. Okay, this is probably the clearest instance of where the commandment is saying more in the words than at first appears. For if the commandment says, thou shalt not commit adultery, then one must know what adultery is in order to not commit it. Adultery, this context, adultery is a married person sleeping with someone they're not married to, or an unmarried person sleeping with a married person, okay? So that's the very specific, narrow definition of adultery, but because of that narrow definition, we can broaden it out and understand that we can sin against our sex and sexuality in much more profound ways than simply that very specific instance. Minimally, if adultery is about married people having sex with the wrong people, then that must mean marriage is a thing. And if marriage is a thing, then it's possible to sin against the institution of marriage. And so the various sins against our sex and sexuality, against chastity, the virtue that governs our right sexual living, and against marriage, which is the way that most of us are called to live our sexuality out, include things like masturbation and pornography use. I'll say something more about this in a moment. Fornication, that's when two people who aren't married sleep with each other. Adultery, when at least one of the people who you're sleeping with that you're not supposed to is married. Homosexual practices or acts. Divorce, more on that. Polygamy. Open marriage, or free unions is what the Catechism says, but we'd call it open marriage in the States today. Sterilization and contraception. Okay? The big idea here is that the church is not down on sex, the church doesn't hate sex, the church doesn't think that sex is always bad. But here is the most important insight about sex that I've ever come to, as a person who is vowed not to have sex, but who listens to other people's sex lives in the confessional all the time. Sex is the one thing in the whole of the human experience that goes from being a sin, and probably mortally so one day, to being a sacrament, or at least a sacramental action the next day. And that's really confusing. There's not much else in life that goes from being absolutely forbidden to being sacred, like overnight like that. And because of that, and because most of our first experiences of sex and sexuality are in its sinful state, it makes it very, very difficult to recognize in its sacramental state. What I'll often say to young couples when they're struggling with fornication, so like a couple who's engaged to be married, but who have gotten into the habit of having sex regularly, is you don't want to get used to this in its sinful state, or you won't be able to recognize it in its sacramental state. It would be like if you grew up eating always and only Taco Bell, and then you married a girl from Mexico, you wouldn't be able to eat her cooking. Your stomach would reject it, right? Or if you grew up only on frozen pizza, and then somebody tried to make you a real homemade pizza, you wouldn't care for it. You've gotten used to the cheap second-rate version. The sacramental expression of sexuality that happens in marriage is really meant to mirror the relationship between Christ and his church. It's the total self-giving of one to the other, which is a radical act and implies all kinds of things that we can't do if we're not in a permanent, exclusive, fruitful union that we know we can really rely on. That's the reason masturbation is so problematic, right? Is because it takes what is intended to be a coupled experience with another person and it makes it a solitary experience. It's the reason pornography is so problematic, because it takes especially the experience of a couple that is meant to be shared between the two of them alone and exposes it for the view and use of other people. Adultery is sort of the primal rejection of the marriage covenant, of the bond that exists between husband and wife, because it says, I will remain faithful, and I don't. And time again in the Old Testament, adultery is used as the image of our experience of sin relative to God. You know, Israel is compared to an adulterous wife who's coupled to a virtuous husband, the Lord, but who can't help it. She keeps spreading her legs for everybody else. Homosexual practices. This is obviously one of the hardest because gay marriage, not only gay marriage, but just gay relationships in general have become much more accepted in contemporary society than they have often historically. Homosexual practices are understood to be problematic precisely because it's only in the union of husband and wife that this experience of, that this expression of the love of Christ and his church can come to full fruit. Why is that? Well, because the most perfect experience of the most perfect expression of this sexuality is when a man and a woman make love to each other, and that love-making produces a new life. Why? From the beginning, the Father has loved the Son perfectly, holy, and eternally. And from the beginning, the Son has loved the Father perfectly, holy, and eternally. And that love constitutes a relationship that is another person, the Holy Spirit. And so the husband strives to love the wife perfectly and holy and absolutely, and the wife strives to love her husband perfectly and holy and absolutely, and together that love bears fruit in a new person. The reason homosexual acts have historically been understood to be so diametrically opposed to what the church understands marriage to be is precisely because they don't ever produce new people. It's also the reason that the church gets anxious around redefinitions of marriage, because we have experience of this, right? There was a time when marriage was forbidden, and that caused all kinds of problems for us later. And then there was a time when marriage was enforced, and that similarly caused problems. So the church has lived through redefinitions of marriage before, has not gone well for us. Divorce. This may touch us even more directly, many of us, than the homosexuality piece. So divorce is listed here as a sin, which is not to imply that each and every divorce is individually sinful. The Catechism is very, very clear on this one, that separation for the sake of the safety of one or the other of the spouses and or the children is sometimes not only necessary but laudable, and that a civil divorce needing to be obtained in order to ensure that separation and preserve that safety is in no way sinful. So divorce isn't by itself a sin, but it virtually always implies that some sin has happened before to cause the divorce. So divorce reflects a sinful state, a failure in the attempt to stay faithful to the covenant, whether that's sexually faithful or emotionally faithful or whatever else. And so divorce is listed as an offense against marriage, not so much because that each individual divorce is a personal offense against the sacrament of matrimony, but the divorce is an institution, and especially the way states handle divorce. Over here I said that the state has an obligation to protect the family. The way states have come to regularize divorce often doesn't protect the family and actually incentivizes couples to break up. Polygamy, those of us under 40 probably know some couple that has at least tried to be poly at some point. It doesn't work. I don't really feel the need to offer lots of commentary on that. It just doesn't work. I know several people who have tried, even Protestant ministers. It doesn't work. It didn't work in the Old Testament, and the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob are largely designed to show us the problems with polygamy. The demise of Solomon is largely the result of him having too many women. And so polygamy always, in one way or another, winds up disadvantaging the parties who are multiple, whether that's polygamy, so a man with many wives, or polygyny, a woman with many husbands. Open marriage is similarly problematic, except that at least polygamy attempts to make things institutional. I was ordained with a guy from Cameroon who was a second-generation Christian, and he used to talk about how with his grandfather had a house in the middle of the compound, and he had 7 wives, and the wives had smaller houses sort of surrounding the big house in the middle, and the wives would take turns cooking each day. So they would come, everybody would congregate in the big house to eat, and if the husbands liked the wife's food, then she and her kids were allowed to stay in the big house that night. If he didn't like the food, they had to go back. If you can't see the inherent injustices in this, then we probably need to go back to the beginning. Open marriages create a similar degree of dysfunction, but with less support. And they tell the lie that the fidelity attached to the marriage is unrelated to the sex lives of the couple. It's precisely because the church values sex, not disvalues sex, that we insist that open marriage is so problematic. Sterilization and contraception. 2 things need to be said here. The first is the church doesn't think that each and every sexual act has to produce a child. It simply has to be open to life, in the same way that each and every prayer needs to be open to God's answering it. And if you're not open to the answer, you shouldn't pray for it, right? Sterilization, of course, can happen for a variety of reasons, not all of which are necessarily sinful. A man has testicular cancer and loses one or both testicles, he is effectively sterilized. But that's not a sin. That's attending to a medical condition, right? That's removing a diseased body part. So the sterilization is an unintended consequence of the good action of the healing remedy for the cancer. A woman having a hysterectomy is at least potentially in the same boat. So it isn't necessarily sinful